My father smiled when he pressed the button that was supposed to embarrass me. We were halfway through my wedding reception, inside a restored textile mill in Rhode Island, with brick walls, high windows, and nearly everyone I loved, seated beneath strings of warm lights. Dad had just finished another joke about me, taking the scenic route through life. A few people laughed, because that was the version of me my parents had been selling for years. Rachel, the oldest daughter who took too long. Rachel, who changed direction. Rachel, who never quite finished what she started. Dad clicked the wireless presenter, and instead of the next photograph, my mother's voice came through the ballroom speakers. She still thinks Boston rejected her. The laughter stopped so completely that I heard a fork hit a plate somewhere behind me. Dad stared toward the audiovisual booth. Mom moved first, crossing toward the podium with her eyes fixed on the presenter Dad had set on the edge when the audio began. I was closer. I picked it up before she could. "Rachel," she said under her breath. I looked at her, then at my father. "Don't leave yet," I said. "The next slide is for both of you." That happened nearly 5 months ago. And my father pressed that button because he still believed the story of my life belonged to him. Before I take you back to the morning when I learned what my parents had hidden from me, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from. Stay with me, because what I found in one old envelope changed everything I thought I knew about my family. And if you enjoy stories about people finally taking back control of their own lives, subscribe to the channel and keep listening. The morning before my wedding, I drove from our place near Providence to my parents' house in Warwick. The trip usually took about half an hour, and I spent most of it mentally sorting through the ordinary problems that seem enormous the day before a wedding. The florist needed confirmation on delivery access. Nathan had received another question about the seating chart. My mother had already texted twice about whether there was still time to move one of my father's cousins closer to the head table. By then, I had gotten fairly good at telling my mother no. When I walked into the house, Susan Anderson had taken over the dining room with boxes. Photo albums, school programs, old birthday cards, certificates, ticket stubs, and folders were spread across the table. My mother saved everything. She did not merely keep family history, she curated it. Every school play program, every report card, every photograph came with a story about what it supposedly said about us. "You're here," she said. "Good. I found 3 more pictures for the slideshow." I set my purse on a chair and told her I had come for Grandma's lace handkerchief and the album Claire wanted, then reminded her that we were not changing the seating chart. Mom looked up as if I had accused her of a felony and said she had only been asking because Dad thought Aunt Diane would feel pushed aside. I told her Dad could sit with Aunt Diane at breakfast on Sunday because the seating chart was done. There had been a time when that exchange would have ended with me explaining myself for 10 minutes. At 37, I no longer believed every boundary required a closing argument. Mom gave me a tight smile and went back to her boxes, while I started looking for the album. One carton had my name written across the top in my mother's block handwriting. Rachel. School. College. Work. I opened it and found the usual archaeological layers of my life. A high school honor certificate, a campus map, a program from my college graduation, a faded name badge from my first job. Then I saw the envelope. It was cream-colored, heavier than ordinary mail, with a brown half-moon stain near one corner where somebody had once set a coffee cup too close. My full name was typed across the front. Rachel Elizabeth Anderson. The return address was in Boston. For a second, I didn't move. Mom noticed what I was holding, and her hand came across the table faster than I expected. "That's just old college paperwork." I pulled the envelope back without thinking, and reminded her that it had my name on it. She told me we didn't have time to go through every piece of junk the day before my wedding. That was all she said. No confession. No panic. Nothing dramatic enough that I could point to it later and say, that was the moment I knew. I didn't know. I only knew she had reached for it too quickly. "I'll take the whole folder," I said. Mom gave a small shrug, but I saw the muscles in her jaw tighten. I put the folder beneath the album and carried both into the den before she could decide she needed them back. Then I opened the envelope alone. The first word was, "Congratulations." I read it once and then again. The letter was addressed to me. It named the Historic Preservation Fellowship Helen Ward had nominated me for when I was 24. It listed the start date, the 2-year term, the funding, and the reporting instructions. At the bottom was Helen's name along with the program director's signature. I sat down because suddenly standing felt like something I needed to think about. For 13 years, I had believed I had made it to the final round, and lost. My mother had been the person who told me. They went with someone else. I could still hear her voice saying it in our kitchen while Ethan was recovering from the car accident. I could remember trying to act as if it did not matter, because our family had bigger problems that week. I had blamed my portfolio, my lack of experience, my interview. I had spent years thinking Boston was one more door I had failed to open. But the letter in my hand said the door had opened. That did not automatically mean my mother had closed it, and I needed to remember that. I took photographs of every page, front and back, saved them to my phone, emailed copies to myself, then folded the original along its existing creases and put it inside my purse. Nathan was at home dealing with a delivery issue when I called him, and I did not ease into it. I found an acceptance letter from Boston. He paused before asking if I meant the fellowship. I said yes, and he reminded me that I had always believed I didn't get it. "So did I said. I told him what the letter said and what Mom had told me back then. By the time I finished, I had already decided I was going back into the dining room to confront her. I need to ask her what she did. Nathan did not tell me to calm down. He knew better. Instead, he asked, "What do you know, and what are you assuming?" I hated the question because it worked. I told him I knew I had been accepted, and knew Mom had told me I wasn't, but I did not know who opened the letter first, whether another message had arrived, or whether anyone had responded to it. "Then find out," he said. "That was why I married Nathan. Not because he made decisions for me, but because he respected me enough to make me separate anger from evidence." I looked at the date again, and my stomach tightened. The letter had been issued during the same week Ethan was admitted to the hospital after his crash. Suddenly, I remembered something I had not thought about in years. I had been running between work, the hospital, and my parents' house, terrified I would miss an important application message. I had given Mom temporary access to the email account I used for applications and asked her to watch it for me. I had trusted her to tell me if anything important arrived. That memory was not proof either, but now I had a question worth asking someone outside my family. Before noon, I found an old professional address for Helen Ward and sent a short message. I kept it neutral, telling her I was reconstructing an old career timeline and had found a fellowship acceptance letter from 13 years earlier. I asked whether she remembered the final disposition of my application, then left a voicemail at the number listed for her department. I did not accuse my mother. I did not tell Helen what I suspected. I did not want to contaminate the answer before I got it. Only after I sent the message did I let myself look at the date one more time. The fellowship letter had been written 3 days before my mother told me Boston had chosen someone else. 13 years earlier. Boston had not been some vague dream I talked about when I wanted to sound ambitious. I was 24, working an entry-level project coordination job for a small firm that handled renovations, code documentation, and preservation work around Rhode Island. The pay was not impressive, and most days I spent more time updating schedules than making any meaningful design decisions. But I knew where I wanted to go. Historic buildings fascinated me because they carried evidence of every person who had touched them. Old brick could be cleaned, rotten beams could be replaced. Bad additions could be removed without destroying what had been there first. Helen Ward had taught one of my preservation courses, and after graduation she kept sending me listings she thought would move me toward the work I wanted. The Boston Fellowship was the first opportunity that felt like a real door instead of another hallway. 2 years of funded training, fieldwork, and direct experience on restoration projects. When Helen told me I had reached the final round, I started researching apartments and train routes. I did not announce that my life was about to change. I knew better than to celebrate an offer I did not have yet, but I wanted it badly. Then Ethan crashed his car. I still remembered the call more clearly than I remembered what I wore to work that morning. My mother could barely get the words out. There had been an accident. Ethan was alive. He was being taken into surgery. By the time I reached the hospital, my father was pacing near the elevators. Claire was sitting with her knees pulled against her chest, and Mom was trying to answer questions from two different nurses while holding Ethan's phone and insurance card in the same hand. Ethan was 21. 1 week earlier, he had been arguing with Dad about whether he could afford a newer car. Suddenly, we were talking about surgery, rehabilitation, transportation, follow-up appointments, and how long it might take before he could manage ordinary things on his own again. I chose to stay close. That part mattered to me then, and it matters even more to me now. Nobody chained me to my parents' house. Nobody had to threaten me into helping my brother during the worst weeks of his life. I wanted to be there. My father still had to work. My mother was overwhelmed, and Claire was 17 and still living at home. I could help with groceries, rides, phone calls, and the endless little tasks that multiply when someone in a family suddenly becomes a patient. I told my supervisor what had happened and arranged my schedule as best I could. Some days I went from work to the hospital. Other days I stopped at my parents' house before sunrise because Mom had forgotten paperwork Ethan needed at an appointment. I was tired, but I was not being sacrificed. I was making a choice during an emergency, and at the time I expected that choice to have an end. The fellowship application was still active while all of that was happening. I had an email account I used mostly for applications and professional correspondence, and during those first chaotic weeks I gave Mom temporary access. I can still remember sitting at the kitchen counter with my laptop open while she wrote the password on the back of an envelope. "If anything from Boston comes in, call me," I told her. Anything from Helen too. I was not giving her permission to answer for me. I was asking her to watch an inbox because I was missing calls, forgetting meals, and spending hours in places where my phone had to stay silent. Since I was sleeping at my parents' house more often than my apartment during Ethan's early recovery, my paper mail was going there too. At 24, with my brother freshly out of surgery and my mother asking how she could help, none of that felt reckless. It felt practical. A few days later, Mom found me in the kitchen while I was pouring coffee into a travel mug before work. She looked tired enough that I noticed that before I noticed anything else. "Boston went with somebody else," she said. I stopped with the coffee halfway to the lid and asked if she was sure. She said there had been a message and that they had made their final selection. I remember staring at the counter for a few seconds, then asking whether Helen had said anything. Mom told me she had not seen anything from Helen. That hurt more than I expected. I had let myself believe reaching the final round meant I had finally proven something. Instead, my first thought was that my portfolio had not been strong enough. My second was that maybe I had sounded inexperienced during the interview. Neither thought included the possibility that my mother was lying to me. That was one of my flaws long before I had a name for it. When something went wrong, I looked for my own mistake first. It made me dependable at work because I rarely wasted time blaming other people for problems I could fix myself. It also made me easy to deceive in one very specific way. If someone handed me a failure that looked plausible, I would inspect my own performance before I inspected their story. I never called Boston demanding an explanation, because, as far as I knew, there was nothing unusual to explain. Finalists lose opportunities every day. I did not know there had been an acceptance. I did not know there had been a withdrawal. I believed I had received an ordinary rejection at an extraordinarily bad time. I kept helping Ethan, but not forever. His recovery moved in steps instead of miracles. At first, he needed help with almost everything outside the house. Then he could manage more on his own. There were appointments, frustrating setbacks, better weeks, and days when he was furious at his own limitations. Months passed. I increased my hours at work again. I started searching for a better position and looking at apartments because living out of boxes in my childhood bedroom had never been my permanent plan. Mom kept moving the finish line. First, she said, I should stay until Ethan was stronger. then until he could handle transportation more reliably, then until things felt completely normal. One evening, after she used that phrase again, I told her normal might take years and I was not waiting for it. She looked wounded. "Nobody is asking you to give up your life." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm moving." That conversation did not become some dramatic family explosion. Mom sighed. Dad told me not to make everything so rigid. Claire asked whether she could have my old desk after I left. Ethan told me I should have moved weeks earlier, and then immediately asked whether I could still drive him to one appointment the following Thursday, because his ride had canceled. I laughed and said yes. Within roughly a year of the accident, I had my own place again, and was rebuilding the professional momentum I had lost. I did not abandon my family. I simply stopped treating an emergency as a permanent structure. The strange part was how the story changed afterward. At first, relatives would ask about Boston, and Mom would say, "It didn't work out." That was true as far as I knew. Later, the sentence became, "Rachel decided family was more important." I corrected her once at a birthday dinner. "I didn't decide against Boston. I didn't get the fellowship." Mom waved the distinction away and said that everything happened for a reason. Dad laughed and told me not to be so literal. A few years later, the family version had hardened again. Rachel never knew what she wanted. Rachel changed direction. Rachel took longer than everyone else. If somebody mentioned my career, Dad liked to say I had eventually found my way. I disliked it, but I did not challenge every joke, because I still believed the central fact underneath them. I thought Boston had rejected me. Sitting in my car outside my parents' house the day before my wedding, with the original acceptance letter photographed on my phone, I finally understood what bothered me about those old jokes. My parents had not simply remembered the same history differently. They had taken an event I believed was a professional disappointment and gradually turned it into evidence of a defect in my character. The irony was that even the version of history I had believed did not support their story. I had helped Ethan during the worst months, then moved out when the emergency ended. I had changed jobs, taken evening courses, and fought my way back into the field I wanted. I had made choices, plenty of them. The only choice I had never knowingly made was the one my parents kept using to define me. My phone vibrated against the center console just as I was about to start the car. For a second, I assumed it was another wedding message. Then I looked at the screen and saw a name I had not seen in years. Helen Ward was calling me back. I answered before the second ring. "Helen?" I said, and for a moment I was 24 again, waiting for a professor I respected to tell me whether I had been good enough. Her voice was older than I remembered, but unmistakable. She told me she had been surprised to see my name in her inbox, then said something that made me grip the steering wheel harder. "Rachel, I remember that fellowship very well. I was the one who pushed your application into the final review." I asked her whether the letter I had found could possibly have been preliminary or conditional. Helen said no. If it had the program director's signature and the funding details I had described, it was an acceptance. I looked through the windshield at my parents' house and forced myself to ask the next question calmly. Then why did I think I was rejected? Helen did not pretend to remember 13 years of paperwork from memory. She told me she kept an old recommendation index for former students, mostly names, dates, programs, and small notes she had written to herself so she could track where people landed. She was still in her office and had found the entry with my name. There was a notation beside the fellowship. "Accepted," she read slowly. Then she paused. "Later withdrawn. Family reasons." My mouth went dry. I asked who had withdrawn me. Helen said the index did not identify the person who sent the communication, only what the program had recorded at the time. Her older correspondence was not fully indexed, and some of the material she had personally saved from those years was stored with her archived professional files. She promised to look after the weekend, but she would not be able to reconstruct everything before my wedding the next day. "I thought you changed your mind," she said. There was no accusation in her voice, which somehow made the words harder to hear. I asked whether she remembered speaking directly to me after the acceptance, and Helen hesitated. She remembered trying to keep track of me because she had been disappointed that I was leaving the program, but she could not honestly say whether she had reached me personally. Some communication had gone through the contact information on my application, including my parents' Warwick address, because I had been moving between my apartment and home during Ethan's accident. I told her I appreciated her being careful about what she did, and did not remember. I did not tell her my mother had lied to me. I did not tell her my mother had access to my email. I wanted Helen's memory to remain hers, not become something shaped by my suspicion. Before we hung up, Helen said she would send me a brief email confirming what she could verify from the index. I thanked her and sat in my car long after the call ended. Until that moment, I had been holding several possible explanations in my head because I did not want anger to become evidence. Maybe the letter had been followed by some administrative mistake. Maybe I had missed a deadline during Ethan's hospitalization. Maybe there had been a funding change I no longer remembered. Helen had just removed most of those possibilities. Boston had accepted me, and Boston had recorded that I later withdrew for family reasons. Someone had made a decision in my name. I went back inside because my wedding was less than a day away, and the house was filling with people. Ethan had arrived while I was outside, carrying a garment bag over one shoulder, and complaining that Dad had already asked him twice whether he had remembered his shoes. He hugged me, asked whether I was nervous, and immediately noticed that something was wrong. Ethan and I had never been the kind of siblings who needed a formal announcement before a difficult conversation. I told him I had found the Boston acceptance letter. His face changed so quickly that I almost missed it. He looked toward the dining room, then back at me. "Can we not do this tonight?" he said quietly. That answer hit me harder than it should have. "Do what?" I asked. Ethan rubbed a hand over his jaw and said tomorrow was my wedding, the house was already tense, and maybe Boston was something we should talk about afterward. I asked him whether he knew I had been accepted. He did not answer immediately. My anger filled the silence for him. For several ugly seconds, I imagined that Ethan had always known. I imagined him listening while our parents decided I should stay because he needed me, and choosing not to say anything because my presence made his recovery easier. It was an unfair conclusion, and the worst part was that I knew it was unfair even while I was making it. I walked away before I said something I could not take back. In the hallway, I remembered Ethan almost a year after the accident, standing in the doorway of my childhood bedroom while I taped boxes closed. Mom had been irritated that I was moving out. Ethan had leaned against the frame and told me, "If you stay here because of me, I'm going to start charging you rent." Another memory followed. Months later, when I was considering a job farther north, Ethan had told me to take it if I wanted it because he could arrange his own transportation. Those were not the actions of someone trying to keep me trapped at home. His discomfort now meant he was hiding something, but discomfort was not guilt. I had nearly made the same mistake my parents had made with me for years, turning one uncomfortable fact into an entire story about someone's character. I found him near the back porch and told him we would talk before the night was over. "I'm not accusing you," I said, "but if you know something about Boston, I need the truth." Ethan looked relieved and miserable at the same time. He said he would tell me, just not while Mom was walking in and out of the kitchen listening to everything. Before I could ask more, Susan called my name from the dining room and held up a stack of photographs. She had apparently decided the best response to my discovery was to behave as if nothing had happened. She started talking about the slideshow again. I told her I wanted to see it before tomorrow. Her smile tightened. "Absolutely not. It's a surprise." I reminded her that it was my wedding and said I did not want some collection of childhood disasters and bad haircuts turned into a comedy routine. She laughed and told me I was being dramatic. "It's affectionate, Rachel. Your father worked very hard on it." I told her affection was not a magic word that made humiliation harmless. She rolled her eyes and said Nathan's family would finally get to see the real me instead of the polished version they knew. That sentence was enough for me. I stepped into the den and called the wedding coordinator. I did not ask her to remove my parents' presentation. I simply confirmed something Nathan and I had already established when we signed the event documents. Any presentation, speech, or audiovisual material shown during our reception had to remain inside the timeline we approved as the client's. I asked her to make sure no replacement files were accepted tomorrow without one of us authorizing them. She said that was already standard for their event plan and promised to flag the audiovisual team. At that point, I still had no revenge plan. I was protecting the wedding from a surprise my mother had just refused to show me. Helen's email arrived shortly afterward. It was brief, careful, and almost painfully ordinary. She wrote that she had reviewed her old recommendation index and could confirm that I had been accepted into the fellowship. Her notation later showed that the program understood I had withdrawn for family reasons. She emphasized that she had not yet located the underlying correspondence and did not want to speculate about who had communicated the withdrawal. I read the email twice because I needed to keep the boundaries of the evidence clear. I knew I had been accepted. I knew the program believed I had withdrawn. I still did not know who had answered for me. Then I looked across the room at Ethan. He had been watching me from beside the window, waiting because I had told him we were going to finish the conversation. I walked over and showed him only the first 2 lines of Helen's email. His shoulders dropped. "I knew there was something about Boston," he said. "I just didn't know it was this." I asked him what he meant, and he looked toward the kitchen again before lowering his voice. "There's something I heard after the accident. Almost a year later. I should have told you then." He swallowed and met my eyes. "I never remembered them rejecting you, Rachel. I remembered you leaving." Ethan and I went out to the back porch, where nobody could hear us without deliberately following. He leaned against the railing and stared into the yard for a few seconds before he spoke. "It was almost a year after the accident," he said. "I was doing a lot better by then, driving again sometimes, taking classes again. I knew exactly what period he meant. It was around the time I had started packing my things and telling Mom that helping during a crisis did not mean moving permanently back into my childhood bedroom. Ethan said he had come home one afternoon and heard our parents arguing in the kitchen. He had stopped in the hallway because Mom sounded angry. "She said something about you leaving," he told me. "Dad said she could still leave next fall. Then Mom said you needed stability and that everybody was finally getting back on their feet." I asked him what he had done after hearing that. His face tightened. "Nothing." He said he had gone upstairs and pretended he had never heard the conversation. At the time, he assumed Mom and Dad were talking about one of my job applications, or maybe another graduate program. He knew Boston had been important to me, but he believed the same thing I did, that I had not received the fellowship. "I figured if there was somewhere you wanted to go, you'd tell us," he said. "And I didn't want to ask, because—" He stopped, then forced himself to finish. "Because part of me was glad you were still around. I was 22 and scared half the time. You made everything easier." There was a version of me from earlier that afternoon that would have grabbed onto that admission and turned it into proof. Ethan had benefited from my staying. Ethan had heard something. Ethan had kept quiet. But I also remembered the brother who had encouraged me to move out and joked that he would charge me rent if I stayed because of him. He had been recovering from a serious accident, learning how much of his old life he could get back, and assuming his older sister would make her own decisions because that was what I had always done. Silence was not admirable, but it was not the same as answering an email in my name. "You should have asked me," I said. "I should have," he answered. I nodded because I wanted him to own that much and no more. "But you were hurt. You didn't answer for me." The relief on his face made me realize how badly he had expected me to make him carry someone else's guilt. Claire joined us a few minutes later, after noticing that both of us had disappeared. When Ethan told her what we were discussing, she frowned and said something I had forgotten entirely. She remembered Mom talking about me around that same period and saying I needed stability, not another big idea. Claire had been 17, worried about Ethan and more interested in finishing high school than analyzing our mother's language. She had heard it as concern. Sitting there 13 years later, I heard something different. Mom had already been describing my ambition as instability. Going somewhere new was a big idea. Staying where I was useful was stability. It was not proof that she had withdrawn me from Boston, but it explained how easily the family story had changed afterward. If I wanted something Mom could not control, the wanting itself became evidence that I did not know what I was doing. That evening, I asked my parents one final time to show me the slideshow. Dad had joined Mom at the dining room table, arranging photographs in some order that apparently required a great deal of secrecy. "I'm serious," I told them. "If there's anything in there designed to embarrass me, take it out." Dad laughed and said Nathan's family deserved to know what he was marrying into. I told him Nathan knew me considerably better than anyone who needed old photographs to explain me. Mom sighed and accused me of having no sense of humor. "Don't turn me into a joke at my own wedding," I said. Dad looked up from his laptop and gave me the same patient expression he had used when I was 16. "Rachel, if you can't laugh at yourself, that's part of the problem." I held his gaze long enough to make sure he understood I was not joking, then walked away. By late evening, most of the family had gone home or upstairs. I was searching for the charger I had left near the den when I heard Mom's voice from the sitting room. I stopped in the hallway because I heard my name. "When the slideshow starts, everyone will see what a failure she is," she said. There was amusement in her voice, the kind that made the words worse because she did not sound angry enough to know she was being cruel. Dad answered more quietly. I could not catch every word, but I heard him say, "Leave Boston out of it." Mom replied that she knew what she was doing. I stood there with one hand around my phone, feeling an almost physical urge to walk in and demand everything at once. Instead, I opened the recorder on my phone. I pressed record, stepped through the doorway, and made myself part of the conversation before either of them said another word I intended to keep. "What exactly are you planning to say about Boston tomorrow?" I asked. Mom jerked around. Dad's face changed less dramatically, but his hand closed over the edge of the table. Mom recovered first. "For heaven's sake, Rachel. How long have you been standing there?" I told her long enough to hear that they planned to use my life as a punchline. She said I had misunderstood a private conversation. "Then explain it," I said. "Explain Boston." Dad told me this was neither the time nor the place. I reminded him that he had just been discussing it the night before my wedding, which made his timing objection difficult to take seriously. Mom crossed her arms and said the slideshow was affectionate, that the whole point was to show how far I had come. I asked her why she had told me 13 years ago that Boston chose somebody else when Helen Ward had confirmed that I had been accepted. Mom's expression froze for half a second. Then she said, "You are digging through ancient history because you're nervous about tomorrow." I asked again. She tried another direction, telling me Ethan had been in terrible condition and that none of us remembered those months perfectly. "I remember you telling me they rejected me," I said. "Did they?" Mom glanced at Dad. It was small, but I saw it. Dad said my name in warning. Not to me, but to her. Mom's anger flashed immediately. "Oh, stop acting like I'm the only person who knows anything," she snapped. Then she looked back at me. "You still think Boston rejected you because there was no point dragging all of that back up after everything our family was going through." The room seemed to narrow around the words. She had not answered the question I asked, but she had answered something larger. She knew my belief was false. Dad pushed his chair back. "Susan, stop talking about Boston." Mom turned on him. "Why? Because you want this all sitting on me?" He told her again to stop. She laughed once, without humor. "You're the one who handled the second answer." I looked from her to him. For the first time that night, my father looked genuinely afraid of where the conversation was going. "What second answer?" I asked. He stood and told me the conversation was over. I asked again, but he walked past me toward the hallway while Mom stared at him as if she had just realized she had said something she was not supposed to say. Later, in the dark guest room where I was supposed to be sleeping before my wedding, I listened to the recording from the moment I entered that room. I heard my own voice asking about Boston, Mom admitting that she knew I still believed a rejection that had never happened, and Dad repeatedly trying to shut the subject down. Then I reached the sentence that had changed the expression on his face, and I played it again because I wanted to be certain I had heard every word correctly. My mother's voice came clearly through the speaker. "You're the one who handled the second answer." Nathan listened to the recording twice without interrupting. By then, it was late enough that the house had gone quiet, and I had come home because I refused to spend the night before my wedding under my parents' roof after what I had just heard. I sat at our kitchen table with the cream-colored acceptance letter beside my phone while Nathan made notes on a legal pad. Not theories, facts. That distinction mattered more than I wanted it to. Susan knew I still believed Boston had rejected me. Michael wanted Boston kept out of the slideshow. Susan said Michael had handled a second answer. Those were facts. The conclusions fighting for space in my head were something else. I did not know what the second answer was. I did not know whether Michael had helped Susan with the original withdrawal, or done something separate later. I did not even have the original withdrawal correspondence yet. Helen had confirmed only that the program recorded me as having withdrawn for family reasons. I hated how incomplete that was, but incomplete evidence did not become complete because I was furious. My first decision that night was not one I am proud of. I opened the family group chat and started composing a message. I attached photographs of the acceptance letter. Then I selected the recording. I wrote that anyone who had spent years listening to my parents call me indecisive deserved to hear what they had been hiding. I imagined sending it before midnight, before Mom could call Aunt Diane, or Dad could tell Ethan I was overreacting. I wanted to get there first. For once, I wanted my version to enter the room before theirs did. My thumb hovered over the send button long enough for Nathan to notice. He did not reach for the phone. He only asked what I was trying to accomplish. "I'm stopping them before they do this tomorrow," I said. "Are you?" he asked. "Or are you trying to hurt them before they hurt you?" The question irritated me because I knew the answer immediately. I was afraid. Not of the slideshow itself anymore, but of waking up the next morning and discovering that my parents had already called half the family with a softer version of what happened. I wanted to close every door before they could use it. Nathan looked at the acceptance letter, then back at me. "Do you want to win the race to embarrass each other, or do you want them to stop owning the story?" I told him those felt like the same thing. He said they were not, and then he stopped talking. He left the decision with me. I stared at the message until the anger behind it became obvious even to me. Then, I deleted the draft. That did not mean I was going to do nothing. Earlier that evening, before the confrontation with my parents, I had already told our wedding coordinator that no audiovisual material could be changed without approval from Nathan or me. After listening to the recording, I emailed her again and asked to see the presentation my parents had submitted on Thursday. Nathan and I were the clients on the venue contract. The presentation was scheduled on our reception timeline and would run through the venue's equipment. I was not asking for access to my father's laptop or stealing a flash drive. I was asking to review material someone else intended to display at my wedding. The coordinator sent us a secure preview early the next morning. Watching it was worse than overhearing Mom, because this was no longer a careless sentence spoken in private, it had been planned. The first few slides were ordinary childhood photographs. Me missing my front teeth. Me holding Claire as a baby. Ethan and me wearing matching holiday sweaters we both hated. Then the tone shifted. There was a picture of me in the uniform from the restaurant where I had worked evenings while rebuilding my career. The caption called it, "Rachel's Glamorous Professional Era." Another slide showed the first apartment I rented after moving out of my parents' house, with a joke about how I had finally discovered furniture did not come free with rent. There was a later graduation photograph, and a line about me taking longer than everyone else to decide what I wanted to be when I grew up. Then I reached the segment Dad had apparently been saving for the reception. The title was, "Rachel's Scenic Route." Underneath were photographs from different years, arranged to make my life look like a sequence of abandoned attempts. A job change, an evening class, a tiny apartment, a construction helmet from one of my early restoration projects. Things I had once been proud of looked ridiculous when placed beside captions written by people determined to make them mean something else. The final slide showed Nathan and me together. Dad's planned line was written in the presenter notes. After all those unfinished chapters, Nathan finally got Rachel to finish something. Nathan read it over my shoulder. His jaw tightened, but he did not say what I was already thinking. My parents were planning to make our marriage the punchline to a story in which I had spent my entire adult life failing until a man finally fixed me. I called the coordinator. I want the presentation left exactly as submitted until the section called Rachel's Scenic Route, I told her. Then I explained what I wanted, changed. I did not ask anyone to edit my parents' photographs to make them look worse. I did not create fake captions or rearrange their words. I gave the audiovisual technician a short excerpt from the recording, beginning after I had entered the conversation. My own voice asking about Boston was included so there could be no confusion about context. Then came Mom, acknowledging that I still believed, a rejection she knew had never happened, Dad trying to shut Boston out of the discussion, and Mom saying he had handled the second answer. After that audio, I asked for a scan of the acceptance letter to appear on screen. The next slide contained only a short transcript of Mom's sentence about the second answer. No accusation beneath it. No arrow pointing at Dad. No dramatic headline telling the guests what to think. I did not know what the second answer meant yet, and I refused to pretend otherwise. The technician built one master playback file. Nathan and I reviewed it from beginning to end. The coordinator confirmed that once we approved it, the booth would not accept a replacement file from anyone except us or her. Dad would still use the same wireless presenter he had been promised. Each click would advance the master file on the venue computer. He could give his speech exactly as planned. He simply no longer controlled what happened when he reached the section he intended to use against me. There was one condition I insisted on. If my parents backed away, I would back away too. If Dad skipped the slideshow, nothing played. If Mom admitted that morning that they had crossed a line and asked for the presentation to be removed, I would remove it. I still intended to confront them about Boston after the wedding. I was not offering forgiveness. I was deciding that my reception would not become a battlefield unless they carried the weapon into it themselves. When Mom arrived at the venue later that morning, she was dressed, composed, and behaving as if our conversation from the night before had never happened. I asked her privately, "Is there anything in that slideshow designed to embarrass me?" She smiled with the patience people use when they think you are being difficult for sport. "It's affectionate. You'll laugh when you see it." I told her I was asking one last time. She touched my arm and said, "Rachel, stop trying to control every little thing. Let your father have his moment." I pulled my arm away gently. "If you turn my life into a punchline today, that will be your choice." She frowned, but she did not ask what I meant. She walked away convinced she still had the surprise. I watched her go and understood that I had done everything I could do without surrendering my own wedding to them. Less than an hour before the ceremony, I was standing near the entrance to the bridal room when I heard Dad speaking to the coordinator in the hallway. "My presentation is still queued, right?" he asked. She did not lie to him. "The approved reception file is ready." Dad thanked her and walked away smiling. He had been given every chance to put the remote down. He was still planning to pick it up. By the time I walked into the restored mill that Saturday afternoon, I had slept less than 3 hours. The strange thing was that exhaustion made some parts of the day feel sharper instead of duller. I noticed the old brick walls first, then the black steel beams crossing the ceiling, and the tall factory windows that had once belonged to a building nobody thought worth saving. My work had taught me that restoration was not about pretending damage had never happened. It was about understanding what could still carry weight, removing what could not, and refusing to confuse age with ruin. I did not let myself turn that thought into a speech about my family. I had a wedding to attend, and for the next few hours I wanted to be a bride before I was anything else. Nathan was waiting near the front of the ceremony space when I saw him. He smiled in a way that made every conversation about Boston disappear for several seconds, and that was exactly what I needed. We had spent months making decisions about this day together, most of them so ordinary that I had complained about them at the time. Chairs, music, dinner choices, whether we needed one more table near the windows. Standing there, I was suddenly grateful for every boring decision because they belonged to us. When I reached him, he squeezed my hand and whispered, "You made it." I whispered back that he sounded surprised, and he said, "I meant through the planning." I laughed, and for the length of our ceremony, my parents did not own a single inch of my attention. The ceremony was simple. Nathan's voice caught once during his vows, which I knew would embarrass him later and make me love him more. When I said mine, I did not think about the acceptance letter hidden in a safe place at home or the recording queued inside a master presentation file. I thought about the man in front of me, the life we had built before getting married, and the fact that he had never once asked me to become smaller so he could feel more necessary. By the time we walked back down the aisle together, I had almost convinced myself I could get through the reception without using anything I had prepared. Mom made that hope surprisingly easy to hold on to at first. Susan moved through the cocktail hour like the mother of the bride in a magazine photograph. She adjusted the back of my dress before pictures, complimented Nathan's relatives, remembered names I had forgotten, and hugged people with both arms. She told one of his aunts that she had never seen me look happier. Watching her, I had a moment I am not proud of but still understand. I wondered whether I had become cruel by looking backward. Maybe fear had distorted what happened 13 years ago. Maybe Mom had made one terrible decision during Ethan's accident and spent years avoiding it because she was ashamed. Maybe I was about to take something complicated and flatten it into villainy because anger felt cleaner. Then I went back to what I actually knew. The acceptance letter was real. Helen had confirmed that I had been accepted and that the program recorded a withdrawal for family reasons. My mother had admitted, while speaking directly to me the night before, that she knew I still believed Boston had rejected me. My father had tried repeatedly to keep Boston out of the conversation. And the presentation my parents submitted contained an entire section designed to turn my early adult life into a joke. I did not have to decide whether they were monsters. I only had to decide what I would allow them to do that night. Dinner began without incident. Dad gave a short welcome and kept it harmless enough that I started wondering whether my warning had worked. He thanked everyone for coming, made a joke about how expensive weddings had become, and told Nathan he was officially responsible for remembering my coffee order. Then he used the phrase I had heard all my life: "Rachel has always taken the scenic route." Several relatives laughed because they knew the line. Dad smiled and added that I had finally found the right destination. It was irritating, but it was not enough for me to stop anything. One joke was not the line I had drawn. I looked toward Mom instead, and she gave Dad a small nod before lifting her glass. I could not know what that nod meant. I only knew, he continued. Before the slideshow started, I found Dad near the side of the room, while the audiovisual technician checked the next item on the schedule. The wireless presenter was already in his hand. I kept my voice low enough that nobody else had to hear. "You can skip the slideshow." Dad studied my face, and for a second I thought he might ask why. Instead, he smiled with the confidence of someone who believed he still understood the board better than everyone else. "Trust me," he said. "Everyone will understand you better after this." I told him I was giving him an exit, not asking for reassurance. He patted my shoulder. "You're too tense. Enjoy your wedding." That was the last chance I gave him. The first slides were exactly what guests expected. Baby photographs, birthday cakes, Claire sitting on my lap when she was little, Ethan and me wearing matching sweaters at Christmas. People laughed in the gentle way families laugh when they recognize old haircuts and bad wallpaper. I laughed once too, because some of those photographs were funny. Then Dad advanced to the years after college, and the room changed so gradually that most people did not notice at first. A picture appeared of me wearing the uniform from the restaurant where I had worked evenings. Dad joked about my executive dining career. Another slide showed my first apartment after I moved out of my parents' house, and he made a comment about how long it took me to graduate from borrowed furniture. People laughed again, but less comfortably. Nathan's hand closed around mine beneath the table. I could have stopped the presentation then. The coordinator was nearby, and one signal from me would have ended it. I did not give that signal, because I had made myself a promise the night before. I would not punish my parents for what I feared they might do. I would respond to what they actually chose to do. The difference mattered to me, especially because for years they had defined my character from choices I had never made. Dad clicked forward. A graduation photograph appeared from the period when I had gone back to evening classes while working full-time. The caption called me a late bloomer. Then came a photograph of me in a hard hat at one of my first serious restoration projects. Dad said, "Rachel tried a little bit of everything before she finally figured out what she wanted to be when she grew up." I heard one person laugh near the back, followed by silence from the rest of the table beside them. Mom was smiling. Nathan was no longer looking at the screen. He was watching me, waiting for my decision. I let Dad make it for me. He clicked again. The title of the next segment appeared on the screen in large letters: Rachel's Scenic Route. I recognized it immediately from the file I had reviewed that morning. This was the section that Dad turned toward the guests with the pleased expression of a man preparing his best joke. "Now," he said, "this is where you really get to know my daughter." He pressed the presenter. The photographs disappeared. My own recorded voice came through the ballroom speakers instead. "What exactly are you planning to say about Boston tomorrow?" Dad stopped moving. Then Mom's voice filled the room. "For heaven's sake, Rachel, how long have you been standing there?" The few people who had still been smiling stopped. Dad turned sharply toward the audiovisual booth as if the technician had made a mistake, but nobody in the booth touched anything. The master file was doing exactly what Nathan and I had approved. My recorded voice asked Mom to explain why she had told me Boston chose someone else when Helen Ward had confirmed that I had been accepted. Dad's face lost its color. He placed the wireless presenter on the edge of the podium without seeming to realize he had done it. Mom stood from her chair. On the recording, Dad's voice said, "Susan, stop talking about Boston." Several heads turned toward my parents in the real room, then back toward the speakers. Nobody laughed now. Mom started toward the podium. The recording continued. Her own voice came through the sound system, sharper than before. "Why? Because you want this all sitting on me?" Dad took one step toward the equipment table, then stopped when my recorded voice asked again what had happened. Mom was moving faster now. I left my chair at the same time. Then the sentence I had listened to in the dark the night before came over the speakers. "You're the one who handled the second answer." Mom reached toward the wireless presenter. So did I. Mom reached for the wireless presenter at the same moment I did, but I was closer. I closed my hand around it and stepped away from the podium before she could take it. Her face had gone pale beneath her makeup. "Rachel, this is private," she said, low enough that she probably hoped only I could hear. I looked past her at the screen, where my parents had just spent several minutes turning my adult life into entertainment. "You made it public when you put my life in your slideshow." She glanced toward the guests, then back at me. For the first time that evening, she seemed aware of the silence around us. I held the presenter at my side and said, "Don't leave yet. The next slide is for both of you." I pressed the button once. The recording stopped, and the cream-colored acceptance letter filled the screen behind me. I did not give a speech. I had promised myself I would not turn my wedding into a courtroom, and anger did not give me permission to claim things I could not prove. "This letter was sent to my parents' house 13 years ago," I said. "It says I was accepted into the Boston Fellowship my family has spent years telling people I failed to get." I let the room read the date and my name for themselves. I never saw this letter until yesterday morning. That was all I needed to say. The laughter from Dad's earlier jokes had already done the rest of the work for me. Mom looked at the screen, then at me. "You don't understand what was happening then." Her voice was louder now, no longer private. "Ethan had just been through a terrible accident. Your father was working. Claire was still in school. We were trying to keep this family together. There it was." She had moved past denial, without seeming to realize it. A few minutes earlier, Boston had been ancient history I was supposedly misremembering. Now, she was explaining why somebody had needed to make the decision for me. "Ethan could barely walk," she continued. "You were needed at home, you know that." A chair moved behind me. Ethan stood up from his table. He looked uncomfortable, but not uncertain. "Don't use me to excuse this," he said. Mom immediately told him he did not understand what those months had been like. Ethan nodded. "I understand exactly what they were like. I was the one in rehab. A few people shifted in their seats. He looked at me before he continued. Rachel helped me, because she chose to help me. I never asked her to give up Boston. I didn't even know she had been accepted. Mom started to say that he had been too young and too injured to understand what the family needed, but Ethan cut her off. Then you should have asked her, not me, her. I watched Mom absorb that without having any answer ready. For years, Ethan's accident had been the most powerful justification available to her because nobody wanted to argue against a family crisis. Now the person at the center of that crisis had refused to be used as her shield. Claire came quietly around the table and stopped beside me. She did not make a speech either. She only stood there, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. Across the room, one of my aunts who had laughed more than once over the years when Dad said I never finished anything was staring down at her plate. I did not feel triumphant looking at her. Mostly, I felt tired of seeing how many people had accepted a story simply because my parents repeated it confidently enough. Dad stepped forward then, using the calm voice he always used when he wanted everyone else to feel unreasonable. This has gone far enough. He looked at the guests, rather than at me. What happened 13 years ago was one terrible decision during one terrible week. Susan was scared. We all were. Nobody was trying to destroy Rachel's future. The wording was careful. He was not denying the acceptance letter. He was not denying that Mom had interfered. He was containing the damage by turning 13 years of lies into a single frightened act. For 1 second, I almost let him. It was the first explanation that gave me something easier to live with. Mom had panicked. Dad had learned later. Both of them had been ashamed. Maybe everything after that had simply been cowardice. Then I remembered the recording. I looked at Dad. One terrible decision? I asked. He told me we could discuss the rest privately after the wedding. Mom looked between us, and something in her expression changed. I could not tell what she knew, only that she was no longer looking at me as the main problem in the room. I lifted the presenter and clicked again. The acceptance letter disappeared. In its place was a plain slide with one line from the conversation I had recorded after walking into the sitting room the night before. You're the one who handled the second answer. Mom read it first. She turned toward Dad. What did you tell her? Dad's eyes stayed on the screen. I had seen him angry, defensive, impatient, and embarrassed before. I had never seen him look trapped. What second answer, Dad? I asked. He finally looked at me. Not here. His voice had lost the calm authority he had been using seconds earlier. This is your wedding. Don't do this here. You chose here, I said. You chose the slideshow. You chose the jokes. You chose to tell a room full of people what kind of person you think I am. So what was the second answer? He did not respond. Mom stepped toward him instead. Michael, what is she talking about? He told her they were leaving. She asked him again, louder this time, and I realized something important from the way she was looking at him. Whatever the second answer meant, she did not seem to know the whole story either. That did not make her innocent. The acceptance letter on the screen had already destroyed that possibility. But Dad's reaction had opened a second question I had not expected to ask in front of anyone, including her. Dad took Mom by the elbow and told her they would talk outside. She pulled her arm free. No, you tell me what she means. He said her name sharply, and several guests looked away out of embarrassment. Nobody applauded me. Nobody started shouting at my parents. Real humiliation was quieter than that. It was Dad standing beneath a screen, carrying his wife's words, while he searched for a sentence that would restore the version of himself everyone had trusted. It was Mom realizing that the man she had expected to help contain her mistake might have a secret of his own. It was relatives who had laughed at me 20 minutes earlier, suddenly finding their napkins fascinating. Mom finally grabbed her purse from the back of her chair. Dad did not look at me again. They walked toward the exit separately, with a few feet between them instead of side by side. Susan stopped once as if she wanted to turn around, but Michael kept walking, and after a moment she followed. The doors closed behind them. I stood in the middle of my wedding reception, holding a wireless presenter I no longer needed, and the first thing I felt was not victory. It was the strange absence of pressure. Nobody was waiting for me to smooth it over. Nobody was asking me to explain my parents to each other. Ethan remained where he was. Claire stayed beside me. For once, the mess belonged to the people who had made it. Nathan came over and took my free hand. "Do you want to end the reception?" he asked. He did not tell me what the right answer was. I looked around the room at our friends, his family, my siblings, the dinner we had chosen, the lights we had spent an embarrassing amount of time discussing, and the old brick walls of the mill. My parents had already taken enough from the day. I was not giving them the rest. "No," I said. "I want to stay at my wedding." The coordinator removed the presentation from the screen. Music came back on a few minutes later, and the evening continued. It was awkward at first, then gradually became ours again. Hours later, after the last guests had left and Nathan and I were finally alone, I checked my phone. I had several messages from relatives, 2 missed calls from Mom, and nothing from Dad. There was also a voicemail from Helen Ward. I almost left it until morning, but the words on that slide were still sitting in my head. I pressed play. Helen sounded careful, almost hesitant. "Rachel, I found something in one of my old professional files. I don't want to jump ahead before I review the dates, but there's an entry from the following year." She paused. There was another opening. The morning after my wedding, I woke up married and furious, which was not the combination I had imagined when Nathan and I booked the room. My phone had accumulated messages overnight from relatives who wanted to know whether I was all right, people apologizing for laughing during my father's slideshow, and a few well-meaning family members, suggesting everyone needed time to cool down. Mom had called 4 times. Dad had not called once. I turned off notifications before reading most of them. Whatever my parents were saying to each other that morning was not mine to manage, and I was not going to spend the first day of my marriage collecting reactions like evidence of victory. There was only one message I cared about because it answered a question that still belonged to me. Helen Ward had said there had been another opening. I called her back later that morning. Helen explained that when she taught and served as a faculty liaison, she kept her own professional recommendation log for students she personally supported. It was not an official admissions archive, and she was careful to make that distinction. The university had changed systems several times since then, and she had no idea what institutional records still existed. What she did have was a personal index of names, programs, dates, and follow-up notes, along with old correspondence she had saved, because recommendation work had been part of her professional files. The night before, she had found my name twice. The first entry was the fellowship I already knew about. The second was dated almost a year later. "I don't want you to hear more certainty than I'm giving you," Helen said. This was not another guaranteed award. I appreciated that immediately. After everything my parents had done with selective versions of the truth, precision had become almost comforting. Helen told me that one of the fellows in the following cycle had withdrawn before the program began. She remembered asking whether I might still be interested in being reconsidered, because my original application had been strong, and because she knew my family situation had affected the first outcome. There would have been another review. There were no guarantees, but there had been a real possibility of getting back into the process. I sat at the small table by the hotel window, while Nathan showered in the next room and stared at the date Helen had read to me. Nearly a year after Ethan's accident. By then, my brother was walking independently and taking classes again. He still had follow-up care, but the emergency phase was over. I had increased my hours at work and was actively looking for my own apartment. Claire was finishing high school. Mom was no longer spending every day managing Ethan's recovery. Whatever justification Susan had used when she took the first opportunity from me, that justification did not fit the second date. "Why didn't you contact me directly?" I asked. Helen was quiet for a moment. "I thought we had." She explained that she had used the contact information she had from my original application and recommendation notes. My parents' Warwick address had still been listed as my permanent contact during the year I was moving back and forth. There had also been a household telephone number attached to an older record. Helen remembered trying to reconnect through the information she had, but she did not trust a 13-year-old memory enough to tell me exactly how every call happened. What she trusted was something she had written at the time. She believed there was correspondence in one of her archived folders that would clarify it. Since the files were in her office storage, she said she could retrieve them when she returned Monday. I spent Sunday with Nathan and did something that would have been almost impossible for the younger version of me. I waited. I did not call Dad and demand an explanation based on Helen's memory. I did not send Mom a message telling her Michael had hidden something from her. I did not announce to Ethan and Claire that our father had stolen a second fellowship from me, because that was not yet what the evidence showed. There had been an opportunity to be reconsidered. Helen believed someone had told her I had moved on. That was enough to make me angry and not enough to justify rewriting the facts. Monday afternoon, Helen called again. She had found the folder. She first sent me a scan of an old correspondence summary relating to my original fellowship. It showed that an acceptance had been issued, and that the program later received a withdrawal under my name, citing family circumstances. It did not prove who had sat at the computer or typed the response. Helen said exactly that. But combined with my mother's admission that she knew I falsely believed I had been rejected, it closed another gap in the timeline. Then Helen sent the document that changed how I saw my father. It was an email Helen had written to the program chair the day she tried to reopen the possibility for me the following year. The language was dry, professional, and completely free of drama. She had noted that she attempted to reach me regarding the unexpected opening. Beneath that was the sentence I read 5 times before I could make myself continue. Spoke with Rachel Anderson's father. He stated Rachel has moved on professionally and does not wish to be contacted directly regarding Boston. There was a date at the top. I knew exactly where I had been in my life that week. Ethan had already started driving short distances again. I had picked up additional hours at work. I was comparing apartment listings. I had recently told Mom that I intended to move out because the family no longer needed emergency-level help. I had not moved on from Boston because I believed Boston had rejected me. I had never told my father I did not want to be contacted. He had made that decision himself. The first betrayal suddenly looked different. Until that moment, I had been holding on to the least painful interpretation of Dad's role. Maybe Mom panicked during the worst week of Ethan's life, answered my email without permission, and told Dad afterward. Maybe Dad had been cowardly enough to keep her secret, but had not actively participated. That version still made him wrong, but it left me a father who had failed to correct a betrayal rather than one who had repeated it. Helen's email took that version away from me. Mom called less than 20 minutes after I received it. She did not ask how I was doing. "Do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" she demanded. She said Aunt Diane would barely speak to her, Claire had stopped answering certain questions, and Ethan had told Dad he needed space. I listened until she said I had humiliated them in front of people who had known us for decades. Then I asked the only question that mattered. "Did you know Dad told Helen Ward not to contact me the following year?" Silence. Not offended silence. Not the sharp pause Mom used before denying something. This was confusion. "What are you talking about?" I repeated the question. Mom said Michael had told her years ago that he had handled Boston after I started talking about moving out, but she believed he meant he had made sure there was nothing left unresolved from the first fellowship. "He never told me Helen came back," she said. I almost sent her the email immediately. My thumb was already over the attachment icon. I wanted to write, "Ask your husband." I wanted Mom to open that document alone and turn on Dad with the same fury she had directed at me. After spending my entire wedding night discovering what they had done together, there was something intoxicating about the idea of letting one piece of evidence split them apart while I watched from a safe distance. Nathan saw my face and asked what I was about to do. I told him. He did not say my parents deserved protection. They did not. He asked me one question instead. "Tomorrow, will you be glad you sent it because it told the truth, or because you knew it would hurt them?" I hated that he could still make me answer questions I did not want to answer. The second one, I admitted. so I put the phone down. I told Mom I had evidence, and that I would discuss it once, with both of them in the same room. Ethan and Claire could come if they wanted, but I was not asking them to take sides. I would not let Dad tell Mom one version, Mom tell me another, and then spend the next month carrying messages between them. Mom started to argue. I told her the meeting was the only conversation I was offering. By the end of that week, we were sitting around my parents' dining table again. This time, there were no wedding photographs spread across it. Ethan had chosen to come. Claire sat beside him. Nathan was with me but stayed quiet. Dad looked irritated rather than nervous, as though he had decided enough time had passed for him to recover his authority. I placed Helen's email in front of Mom. She read the first paragraph, then the second. Her eyes stopped on the date. She looked across the table at my father. When did Helen call? When did Helen call? Mom asked again. Dad looked at the email in front of her instead of answering. He said the exact date did not change what had happened, which was the kind of sentence he used when a fact was dangerous but technically undeniable. Mom pushed the page toward him. It changes everything. Ethan wasn't in the hospital anymore. Rachel was moving out. Dad finally said it had been close to a year after the accident. Mom stared at him. You told me there was nothing left to fix. Dad's expression hardened. After what you did, what difference would one more call have made? Mom looked at him as if he had struck her. It would have made a difference to her. For the first time since I found the acceptance letter, neither of them was talking about what the family needed. They were talking about what they had personally chosen. Dad told Mom that none of this would have happened if she had not opened my acceptance, hidden it, and answered for me in the first place. He described himself as the person who had been left to clean up a disaster she created. Mom did not deny it this time. I started it, she said. Her voice was quieter than it had been at the wedding. I was terrified Ethan would need us for years, and I decided Rachel couldn't leave. I had no right to do that. Then she pointed at Helen's email. But you had a chance to stop it. You had a chance to tell her the truth when the emergency was over, and you did the same thing I did. Dad immediately rejected the comparison. He said he had not forged anything, had not logged into my account, and had not hidden an acceptance letter. All he had done, according to him, was confirm the path I was already on. I asked him what path that was. He said I had a job, I was moving forward, and reopening Boston would only have created confusion after I had already lost a year. You weren't preserving my path, I said. You were choosing it. He told me I was reducing a complicated family situation to one phone call. I looked at the date again and reminded him that on the day Helen called, Ethan was back in classes and I was looking for an apartment. There had been no emergency left for Dad to hide behind. Mom turned toward me. Tell him, she said. Tell him what he did was worse. I was so surprised that I almost laughed. A minute earlier, she had admitted taking the first opportunity from me, and now she wanted me to use my pain as evidence against her husband. Dad heard it too. Are you really going to pretend your mother isn't the reason any of this happened? He asked me. For one ugly second, I wanted to answer both of them. I wanted to assign percentages. Mom stole the first choice in a panic. Dad knowingly prevented me from getting another one after the panic had passed. I could have found the exact sentence that would hurt each of them most. Then I recognized the job they were handing me. It was the same job my family had given me in smaller ways for years. Explain Mom to Dad. Tell Ethan why Dad was upset. Remind Claire what Mom meant instead of what she said. Be the reasonable one. Translate everybody's anger until the house became livable again. Even now, after they had made decisions about my life without asking me, they wanted me to decide what those decisions meant for their marriage. No, I said. Mom frowned. I looked at both of them. I'm not deciding which one of you hurt me more so the other one can sleep better. You made these choices. You can live with them separately. The room stayed quiet after that. Ethan looked down at the table. Claire leaned back in her chair, as if something had just become obvious to her too. Dad asked what I wanted from them if I was not there to hear explanations. I had prepared that answer before the meeting because I knew apologies would be too easy to manipulate. I took out a short list of names. Ethan and Claire were on it, Along with Aunt Diane and a few relatives my parents had repeatedly told that I had quit Boston, had not been ready, or never followed through. I did not include strangers. I did not ask for a social media post. I wanted the lie corrected in the same rooms where they had spent years making it sound true. You each send your own correction, I said. Use your own names. Say that I was accepted. Say that I did not knowingly withdraw. Mom, you say that you hid the acceptance and answered without my permission. Dad, you say that when Helen tried to contact me later, you told her not to contact me directly without asking me, and neither of you gets to use Ethan as the reason. Dad gave a short, incredulous laugh and asked whether I was assigning homework now. I told him he could call it whatever made him comfortable. You're free not to do it. I'm free to decide what kind of relationship I have with people who still need the lie. Until the record was corrected, I told them there would be no pretending everything was normal, and no calling me to manage family problems. Mom sent her first draft 3 days later. It began. During a frightening period in our family, I made a decision I believed was best for everyone. I read that sentence and stopped. I did not correct it for her. I did not send back suggested wording or explain why best for everyone was another way of hiding me inside the family. Claire had received the same message. Less than an hour later, she replied to Mom without asking me first. That still doesn't say what you did. Mom did not answer until the following morning. Her second message was shorter. She wrote that I had been accepted into the Boston Fellowship, that she had hidden the acceptance from me, and that she had sent a withdrawal without my permission because she believed I needed to remain close to the family after Ethan's accident. She added that Ethan had never asked her to do it. There was still justification around the edges, but the central facts were finally plain. For the first time in 13 years, my mother used the same talent she had always used to curate our family history to correct something instead of shaping it. I did not forgive her because of one message. Accountability was not the same thing as reconciliation. Dad responded differently. He sent only me a private message saying Mom's correction proved where the real wrongdoing began. He wrote that he had merely confirmed the path already taken when Helen contacted the family again. I read it once and did not answer. Ethan made his own decision and stopped attending family dinners that existed mainly so everyone could act normal. Claire told both parents she would no longer carry messages between them. A week later, Mom told us she was staying with her sister for a while. I did not ask whether that meant separation, and I did not offer to help arrange anything. By then, Dad had discovered something he had never expected. Being the calmest person in the room no longer made him the authority on what had happened. Ethan would not let him blame Mom and end the conversation. Claire would not deliver his explanations to her. I would not argue with his private messages. For weeks, he refused to send the correction I had asked for, and I let the silence belong to him. Then one evening an email appeared in my inbox from Michael Anderson. The subject line read, "Correction regarding Rachel Anderson." I stared at it for several seconds before opening anything else on my screen. For the first time, I had no idea whether my father was finally ready to tell the truth, or had simply found a better way to defend himself. I opened Dad's email, expecting another argument disguised as an explanation. Instead, the first sentence said, "For years, I allowed people to believe Rachel had rejected an opportunity she was never given the chance to choose." I read it twice before continuing. He admitted that Mom had hidden the original acceptance from me and withdrawn on my behalf. Then he addressed the part that belonged only to him. Nearly a year later, Helen Ward had contacted our family about another possible opening, and he had told her I had moved on and did not want to be contacted directly. "Rachel did not authorize me to say that," he wrote. "I made that decision for her." He still included one sentence about believing he was protecting stability during a difficult period, but for once, he did not use Mom, Ethan, or me to absorb the responsibility. He sent the correction to the same relatives on my list. I did not call him to say thank you. Correcting a lie was not a gift to me. It was something he should have done years ago. Still, when Aunt Diane replied to the email and wrote that she was sorry she had repeated jokes about me, never following through. Something inside me loosened. One cousin admitted he had always assumed I walked away from Boston because that was how my parents told the story. Claire forwarded me a message Mom had received from another relative saying, "I think we all owe Rachel an apology for believing that without ever asking her." I stopped Claire before she could send me more. I did not need a running scoreboard of who had changed sides. The point had never been to make the family hate my parents. The point was that they could no longer make everyone believe a false version of me simply because they spoke first. Mom stayed with Aunt Diane for several weeks. Dad remained at the house in Warwick. I knew that because they told Ethan and Claire separately, and my siblings told me only when it affected plans we were already making. I did not ask whether my parents were going to divorce. I did not ask who had apologized to whom or whether they were sleeping in separate rooms when Mom eventually returned home. Their marriage had spent years depending on a quiet agreement. Mom made emotional decisions, Dad translated them into something reasonable, and I often helped keep the rest of the family from reacting too strongly. Once that structure disappeared, they had to find out what was actually left between them. That was not revenge I had designed. It was simply a consequence I stopped preventing. The first real test came in June. Father's Day fell on the 21st that year, and Mom called me 3 days beforehand. She did not begin by asking whether Nathan and I were coming. She started with Ethan. "He says he isn't coming Sunday," she told me. "You know how your father is. He'll pretend he doesn't care, but this is going to make everything worse." The old version of me would have called Ethan next. I would have asked what he planned to do, translated Mom's fear into something less manipulative, then called her back with a compromise. I had done variations of that job for so long that my mother still assumed I would step into it automatically. "Then Dad should talk to Ethan," I said. Mom was quiet. "You know Ethan listens to you. That doesn't make him my responsibility." She sighed and said she was not asking me to take responsibility, only to help. I almost laughed because those had always been the same request in our family. Help meant make the uncomfortable conversation easier for everyone, except me. "Mom, if Ethan doesn't want to come, that's between Ethan and Dad. If Dad wants to know why, he can call him." Her voice sharpened. "So now you're just going to watch this family fall apart?" "No," I said. "I'm going to stop pretending I'm the thing holding it together." We ended the call without resolving anything. That used to make me anxious for hours. I would replay every sentence, wondering whether I had been too cold. This time I made dinner with Nathan and left my phone on the counter. Ethan did not attend the Father's Day meal. Claire went for part of it and left when Dad started explaining why everybody had become too sensitive. I knew those details because Claire told me afterward while we were having coffee. She did not ask me what she should have said. She did not ask me to talk to Mom. She simply told me what happened, and then we changed the subject. It was one of the healthiest conversations we had ever had. I saw my parents for the first time since our confrontation later that summer at a small family gathering. Mom was polite but restrained. Dad looked older to me, although only a few months had passed. Neither of them mentioned Boston. More importantly, neither of them made a joke about my career, my choices, or the amount of time it had taken me to build the life I had. When an uncle asked about a restoration project I was leading, Dad started to answer for me out of habit. Then he stopped. It was such a small thing that nobody else seemed to notice. I did. There was no dramatic reconciliation. Mom apologized to me again privately, this time without asking me to agree that she had been scared or overwhelmed. I told her I believed she had been scared. I also told her fear did not give her ownership of my decisions. Both things could be true. Dad never became good at apology. His correction email remained the clearest acknowledgement I ever received from him. I accepted that as information about who he was, not as a problem I needed to solve. Nathan once asked whether I thought I would forgive them completely. I told him I had stopped treating forgiveness like a finish line. Trust could grow if their behavior changed. Distance could remain if it did not. I did not owe anybody a deadline. Around the same time, my firm offered me a larger role overseeing an adaptive reuse project that would take almost 2 years. The old version of me would have studied every reason I might not be ready before admitting how much I wanted it. Instead, I asked the questions that mattered, negotiated the responsibilities, and accepted. When I told Nathan, he grinned and asked whether I was sure I wanted to take the scenic route again. I threw a napkin at him. It was the first time that phrase had made me laugh. The cream-colored Boston envelope stayed in my desk for months. At first, I kept taking it out, as if reading the acceptance again could return the life I might have had. Eventually, I understood that the letter had already given me everything it could. It proved that I had not failed. It proved that a choice had been taken from me, but it could not tell me whether Boston would have made me happier, whether I would have stayed there, or whether any alternate version of my life would have been better than the one I had built. I did not need to turn one stolen choice into another prison. So I put the letter in an archival sleeve and stored it with the rest of my important documents, not in a shrine, not in the trash, just where the truth belonged. For 13 years, my parents had told a story in which I was the daughter who never finished anything. It took me longer than it should have to understand why that story survived. I thought being responsible meant carrying whatever landed in my hands. Their emergencies, their explanations, their disagreements, even their version of my past. What I know now is simpler. I am responsible for the choices I actually make. I am not responsible for choices other people secretly make for me, and I am not obligated to protect them from the consequences when the truth finally catches up. You can love your family without giving them permission to make your decisions, rewrite your history, or use your loyalty against you. When something important affects your future, verify the facts, keep your own records, and ask questions before accepting someone else's version of events. Helping your family should be a choice, not a permanent obligation created by guilt. And when people hurt you, accountability does not require revenge. Sometimes it means telling the truth and refusing to keep protecting them from consequences. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe to the channel for more powerful family stories.